Welcome to everyone who is joining us today. We're going to go ahead and give just one more minute for folks to join the webinar.
Okay, it looks like the folks have started to trickle in rather than pour in. And so perhaps we can get things started with some introductory remarks. I want to welcome everyone here to our third event in our virtual speaker series for the Institute for Ethics and Public Affairs. My name is Joseph Stramondo. I am the director of the IPA and an associate professor of philosophy here at San Diego State. And I am a cishet white man with a beard and short hair and thick eyebrows and yeah, a gray shirt. So I want to begin by letting folks know that we have live captioning available for anyone who wants it. And so if you have any questions about how to turn that on, please let us know. I believe, oh wait, I think we're having some technical problems. Okay, there's some folks that can hear, and others that might have difficulty. I apologize. Okay, so we do have live captioning, like I said, and so anybody who needs that can access it, and if they have questions, then let us know in chat. I also want to say that we are going to reserve time for Q&A at the end of the event, after our speaker runs through her talk. And so we can submit questions via either the chat function or the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Just sort of type them out. And I also want to do a brief land acknowledgement. And so we are opening this event today by acknowledging that we at San Diego State University are on occupied land. And this land acknowledgement was actually written by Mike Conley Misquish. And it says, for millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been a part of this land. This land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. As members of the San Diego State community, we acknowledge this legacy. We promote this balance and harmony. We find inspiration from this land, the land of the Kumeyaay. We also want to say that land acknowledgements are important, but not fully adequate when thinking about the work of decolonization. And so I want to paste into chat some resources and information about events and programming that SDSU is sponsoring for Native American Heritage Month as a way of backing up our ideological aspirations with some action. Ooh, I think I just sent it to the captioner. Hold on, let me send it to everybody. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that link. So finally, I just will say that we are the Institute for Ethics and Public Affairs, and it's our mission to promote dialogue and discourse and ultimately research around the ethical implications of public policy and other public concerns. And so this speaker series is part of that effort. But in addition to the IEPA, this event has been co-sponsored by the Bread and Roses Center Feminist Research Colloquium, as well as the SDSU Women's Studies Department. And so we're very lucky to have a broad base here that we're drawing upon to bring in attendees and have resources from a variety of places to be able to have this great speaker. And so with that, I am going to hand things over to Professor Jess Watcott. Jess is an assistant professor in the Women's Studies Department here, and also a core faculty member of the Institute for Ethics and Public Affairs, and they were instrumental in bringing Harsha Walia to our campus virtually today. And so I want to extend my gratitude to Jess and let them take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and welcome everybody. My name is Jess Watcott. I'm an assistant professor in women's studies at San Diego State University. As Joe said, I am a white non-binary person with short brown curly hair. I'm wearing a blue shirt with a leaf pattern on it and a black jacket. And I'm sitting in my office with bookshelves behind me that look like they need more books on them. I'm delighted to virtually welcome Harsha Walia to Kumeyaay territory, also known as San Diego-Tijuana borderlands. Harsha's writing has actually had a huge impact on folks in this area who are organizing for migrant justice, which is where I first encountered her work. I'm a member of two organizations, Free Them All San Diego, which is a coalition based in the region who are trying to build a world without cages, border walls, armed enforcers, and white supremacy, starting with permanently closing Otay Mesa Detention Center, which is about a 20-minute drive away from the campus here. And I encourage folks who are in the area who haven't seen our little prison cluster over there very close to one of the crossing points of the border to go and to visit that area and see how people are living. I also volunteer for Detention Resistance, which is a group with a similar mission statement that also, in addition to working towards closing down Otay Mesa Detention Center, is in direct accompaniment with people who are detained there and doing things like post-release support for people when they get out. They run a hotline where folks can call. Folks who are detained can call and get free information and connect with resources. So it's through that work, and I just wanted to give a shout out to those organizations today, and I'll drop their social media handles in the chat when I'm done speaking if folks would like to get involved if they're inspired by the talk today and would like to get involved in doing similar work in the area. But it's through those organizations that I first learned about Harsha's books, Undoing Border Imperialism and Border and Rural Global Migration, Capitalism, and the Rise of Racist Nationalism. These books have deeply informed people who are organizing to abolish borders and to bring justice to migrant communities. And I know many of those people engaged in that work are joining us on the call today. And so I look forward to all of your questions after the talk. The reason why Harsha's writing's been so impactful is because it comes from her own work as an organizer who's been involved in community-based grassroots migrant justice, feminist, anti-racist, abolitionist, Indigenous solidarity, anti-capitalist, Palestinian liberation, and anti-imperialist movements for 2 decades. It also helps that Harsha is formally trained in law and can therefore speak to both what is without losing the vision of what we want to create in the world. So to help us understand the conditions of border imperialism and really thinking about it as Harsha does in a global framework, but also I think people are going to see in the talk that there's a lot of patterns that are present here, specifically at the US-Mexico border. And to help us strategize about how to abolish it, I'll turn the time over to Harsha. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jess. Thank you so much, Joe. Just briefly, just to describe myself to folks. So I am a Punjabi settler, cis queer femme. I've against a yellow background. I'm wearing glasses. I've got white headphones. My sweatshirt is blue. It says Wet'suwet'en Strong, and I'm against a window here. And I'm on the territories of the Coast Salish people. I'm on the lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. Thank you so much for having me, for being part of this conversation. And in talking through and doing a land acknowledgement about the territories that I'm located on, I really want to be clear that that's not simply an acknowledgement of history, but really of ongoing resistance, reclamation, and resurgence of Indigenous peoples and nations on these territories and across these lands. And, really that, land acknowledgements need to be about us taking action, as Joe said, around land back, and really recognizing that Indigenous laws, Indigenous jurisdiction, and Indigenous self-determination is alive on these lands, right? We have to refuse terra nullius or historicizing Indigenous people into the past, but affirming Indigenous presence and resurgence as alive on lands that we're on today. And for me, it's deeply connected to migrant justice struggles, right? Because Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous land stewardship, and Indigenous defense of the land is fundamentally anti-border, because borders, as we know, around the world, not only on the lands that we're on, but really around the world, are a product of empire. Borders were literally etched onto the land with no consideration for nations and communities who are divided by them. I'm a product of the partition in what is now known as India and Pakistan, when the Punjab was partitioned, in one of the bloodiest displacements in human history as a result of an artificial border that was placed on those lands. And so in that way, for me, anti-border work is bound up in anti-imperial, anti-capitalist organizing, including full and firm solidarity with Indigenous nations struggling for liberation. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm so excited to learn from all of you who are here listening in, and really to be able to engage in a conversation once I'm done, and to hear about all the good work that's happening. So thank you so much for all of you who are here, and for all the organizing that you're doing. Because that's really where that's where the struggle is, right? It's in all of us trying to organize against borders and for collective liberation. I want to start with an invocation. Sometimes I end with it, but I'd like to start with it because I think we're here perhaps for similar reasons, and I want to bring the invocation of Eduardo Galeano, the late great Eduardo Galeano, into the room. And he, in an interview several years ago, said, "The world was born yearning to be a home for everyone. The world was born yearning to be a home for everyone." And for me, that really is the ethical orientation of a no border politics, right? It's the politics of how do we build homes? How do we create homes? How do we ensure that the world is a home for everyone? And of course, in this time, in this era when we're on the edge of climate catastrophe, What does it mean for the world itself to be able to remain as a home? And so let me start by also saying I'm not going to get in too much detail about, the Democrats versus the Republicans, for example, because really bordering is a bipartisan practice in the context of the United States, right? So when we look at the United States and its history, particularly if we're thinking about the past 30 years, we know that the United States, whether it's the Democrats, whether it's the Republicans, have really normalized an entire immigration enforcement apparatus. So whether that's Bill Clinton, whether that's Barack Obama, whether that's current President Joe Biden. And that really, while the degree and the nature of it may fluctuate between the Republicans and the Democrats, that really maintaining social violence and social control through immigration enforcement is bipartisan practice. So it's not just about Trump or the Republicans. And it was under Presidents Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, and I would argue, we're already seeing under Biden, that this entire immigration enforcement apparatus that is bent on expanding detention and deportation, that is bent on criminalizing migration, specifically through prosecutions, and that militarizing the border was cemented. It was the Clinton years that normalized the most severe consequences of border militarization and mass detention. It was under Clinton that Border Patrol tripled in size to become the second largest enforcement agency at the time. We know that President Obama also spent billions of dollars securing the border, and it was under his tenure that border and immigration budgets began to outpace the budgets of all other federal law enforcement agencies combined. Unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, were first tested on the US-Mexico border before they were used by President Obama in drone attacks on Yemen and Pakistan. And it was under President Obama that an average of 3 bombs every hour were dropped, that deportation skyrocketed, and that he earned the moniker of deporter-in-chief for overseeing 3 million deportations. So again, really, without going into history, but I'm happy to talk about it later, we see how this is bipartisan practice. And really, one of the most dangerous rhetoric that we see under the Democratic Party, and that I would argue really is a pillar of the Democratic Party, is the rhetoric of productive and legal immigrants while simultaneously demonizing so-called criminal and illegal immigrants. So what we have under the Republicans or Trump, for example, is much more overtly racist, exclusionary rhetoric where all migrants and refugees are essentially dehumanized. But under Democrats, we really see this divide and rule, divide and conquer rhetoric that's been the cornerstone of their party's immigration platform for 3 decades. But again, I want to zoom away from focusing on political parties to really talk about this foundational structural violence and really how globalized it is. So the first thing that I want to do is actually talk about language, because I think language frames, as we know, how we think about social issues. And in the case of the border and other language alongside, I think it is a huge influencer in how we think about borders, how we think about displacement, and really often limits our political imagination. So I'd like to turn to language to think about reframing a little bit how we're talking about the border. So the first is, I think it's so important to reframe the term migration crisis itself, right? So the global migration crisis that we've been hearing about for decades, but really escalated since 2015, I think it's much more accurately described as a crisis of displacement and immobility. Because when we emphasize displacement, it forces us to interrogate the root causes of conquest, capitalism, and climate change that are the real culprits and drivers of displacement. And also, when we say migration crisis, it assumes that most people are actually able to move, that people are actually migrating, when in fact, most people are actually immobilized. Despite the border panics that are constantly blasted in the media, 95% of forcibly displaced people remain either internally displaced or in refugee camps in neighboring countries in the global south. Scholars have noted that less than 1% of refugees who are living in camps around the world actually find a permanent home. People are not able to move because border controls are deadly, and people are being contained at border sites, in refugee camps, through interdiction, through pushbacks, through restrictive visa requirements, through smart borders, etc. So when we reframe the migration crisis as a displacement and immobility crisis, it illuminates that most migrants are forcibly displaced and systematically immobilized. Displacement and immobility, not free movement, is the reality of racial imperial management in our contemporary era. In this sense, borders are carceral regimes. Police, prisons, and borders all operate by immobilizing the people caught in their crosshairs. Notably, the word mob, right? The word mob, which is a criminalizing vocabulary used to link large groups of poor, racialized people to social disorder, whether in inner cities or at the border, actually derives from the word mobility. So we see how the criminalization of mobility through criminalizing vocabulary like mob is so central to social control. Angela Davis and Gina Dent, in a piece in the early 2000s, wrote, quote, "We continue to find that the prison is itself a border," end quote. Drawing on Davis and Dent, we can say that the prison is a border and the border is a prison. The border is at once domestic and global, and a world without police, prisons, private property, militaries, and borders is a necessarily interconnected abolitionist and decolonial horizon for freedom. Second, the language of migrant crisis or refugee crisis or migrant invasion, these are all pretexts to actually shore up further border securitization and repressive practices of detention and deportation. Images and languages of swarms, floods, caravans, invaders, all depict and villainize migrants and refugees as the cause of a border crisis. The border, the fact that we even think the border is in crisis, right? It's like an inanimate object. It doesn't exist. It's a social construction. But that we can talk about a border crisis and give it that kind of animated life is something that we need to be thinking about. And we know that whenever the state claims a crisis, its responses end up in service to the state and reconfiguration of state power. We see this, for example, in passive languages of border deaths or narratives of criminal traffickers and smugglers. All of this kind of passive language turns the gaze away from the state and launders violent state responses as rescue. And so here, I really want to take up the passive language of border deaths. It has bothered me for decades. And I know it bothers probably many of you. But it's such a problem, right? The ways in which we've normalized talking about border deaths as if though migrants and refugees just happen to die crossing, right? We know that that's not the case. We know that policies like prevention through deterrence are actually intended to kill. What is the deterrence in prevention through deterrence policies? It is death, right? So border policies are meant to kill people. They're not passive, natural, coincidental deaths. These are intended deaths. These are state policies intended to kill. Yet we talk about border deaths passively, and on top of that, media and many mainstream liberal, including liberal responses, really victim blame migrants and refugees, right? Like, why would they go out in the desert in the summertime? Why would you put your child on a dinghy boat? Why would you be crammed in a cargo ship, right? All of these narratives that really victim blame people who are trying to flee for safety, who are immobilized, right? And this kind of victim blaming narrative is so deeply similar and insidiously similar to rape culture, right? The same ways in which survivors are victim blamed is the same way in which, of course, the very gendered border killings are operating at border sites around the world, right? The Mediterranean is the world's deadliest border. And again, not coincidentally, but because Europe has fortified itself. And so, these are the ways in which language is so important when we're thinking about the border. And really, most ironically, I think, and perhaps most offensively, is that this migration crisis is declared a new crisis with Western countries positioned as its primary victims, even though for 4 centuries, nearly 80 million Europeans became settler colonists across the Americas and Oceania, while 4 million indentured laborers from Asia were scattered across the globe, and the transatlantic slave trade kidnapped and enslaved 15 million Africans. Colonialism, genocide, slavery, and indentureship are not only completely erased as continuities of violence and current invocations of a migration crisis, but they are also the very conditions of possibility, for Western notions of border sovereignty. The final thing I'll say on language, this is, perhaps more semantics, but I think it's important, is questioning who is even considered a migrant within the narrative of the migration crisis. And really, when we think about that, it blows open the lid on global asymmetries of power. And this is crucial because, as I argue in Border and Rule, I think migration is actually less about movement and much more about entrenching existing systems of power. So when we're talking about the migration crisis or migrants, we never talk about business travelers, expats, diplomats, vacationers, et cetera, as migrants, even though there are millions of people on the move today, far more than ever were before because of technology, including people Columbusing, and I use that verb deliberately, right? People Columbusing all around the world on luxury yachts, hopping on airplanes in first class, business travel, people with investor class, immigrant visas. All of that kind of movement is not surveillanced, is not under surveillance, is not scapegoated, is not scrutinized, or in any way considered problematic. In fact, under our system of colonialism and capitalism, that kind of movement representing power and the dominant race, class, caste, settler status in the empire is actually celebrated and sought after. Gentrifiers, for example, are the new colonial pioneers, usurping land and property and building gated communities enforced through policing and displacement of homeless camps. So when we say migration crisis, we aren't actually talking about all kinds of movement or anyone on the move. In fact, embedded in the very language of migration crisis is the anti-Black idea of a certain kind of inherently undesirable movement, the unregulated, ungovernable movement of predominantly racialized poor and oppressed peoples. Contemporary immigration enforcement draws heavily from this foundational terror of anti-Black violence, particularly the regulation of Black movement. Ronaldo Walcott and Idil Abdullahi write that, quote, movements that we now call migration are founded in anti-Blackness, taking their logic from transatlantic slavery, end quote. So when the mainstream media and the state invokes a migration crisis, it's not all movement or any and all people crossing borders who they have in mind, but rather it is specifically displaced and immobilized people on the other side of whiteness, on the other side of capital, on the other side of empire, who are being dehumanized, who are being contained, who are being surveillanced and captured by carceral systems and borders. So I really wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about that. Because again, when we rethink about what we even mean when we're talking about the border or migration, it starts to become evident that it has much less to do with movement per se, or the border itself even per se, and much more to do with entrenching systems of racial citizenship and racial capitalism. The next thing that I wanted to talk about briefly is just really thinking through the US-Mexico border, the southern border, and how that further illuminates my point, that it's not actually, the border has as much to do with controlling movement as it does with other systems of power. And so if we look historically, and I'll only do it briefly, if we look at the formation, right, the processes that led to the formation of the southern border, it's so deeply connected to expansion, elimination, and enslavement. It's inseparable. So when we think about the formation of the southern US-Mexico border, it's illustrative in terms of thinking about border formations and how we can think about also social movements, right? And how do we build as social movements? Anti-migrant border controls are often seen as separate from anti-Indigenous and anti-Black genocide. These forms of violence are often seen as parallel to each other. For example, the shared connection is often white supremacy and systemic racism. But generally, migrant justice, Indigenous rights, and Black liberation have been seen as distinct struggles. There's, of course, significant exceptions to this. Here, thinking about the work, for example, of BAJI, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration in the United States. And really, the work of Black and Indigenous organizers and scholars such as Audra Simpson, Shannon Speed, Robin Maynard, Black Alliance for Just Immigration, Red Nation, right now all the work around what's going on in Haiti with the Haitian Bridge Alliance, they have repeatedly pointed out that that is not the case, right? And the problems with such an approach that see these struggles as separated. But just looking back historically for a moment, if we were to look at bordering regimes, particularly again, the southern border, the bordering practices in the US-Mexico border are structurally bound up in anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, as well as imperialist expansion. Often we think of the border as a kind of domestic issue, right? That is separate from global politics. And this again comes back to the kind of liberal frame where we talk about immigration in a domesticated framework. I'm going to come back to this in thinking through global imperialism. But even just looking at the example of the US-Mexico border, that border was formed as a direct result of conquest and the forced annexation of over 525,000 square miles of territory from Mexico. The US seized all of that territory in 1848 after the imposition of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, keeping in mind, of course, the military invasion of Mexico preceding that. This is the history of a lot of nation states' borders. They demarcate territory in ways that are bound up in the workings of empire. The British, the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese were literally creating borders wherever they went in the so-called post-colonial era, when borders were imposed by European colonizers. We often naturalize the existence of borders, which removes them from this entanglement with empire. This is why Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz argues that rhetoric like nation of immigrants is a liberal narrative that erases the violence of conquest and borders upon colonized communities. Further, the formation of the US-Mexico border in the 1840s and 1850s is bound up in Indigenous genocide and anti-Black controls. When the US forcibly annexed territory from Mexico, sovereign Indigenous nations, including the Comanche, the Apache, the Seri, the Kiowa, and many more, were forcibly assimilated into the US nation state. In fact, of course, the entire US nation state is a settler colonial state. And this is the entire history of settler citizenship in places like the US, Canada, and Australia. Immigration and citizenship were weapons to further the genocidal elimination of Indigenous political and social formations. For example, the Dawes Act and the Indian Citizenship Act in the United States basically imposed US citizenship on Indigenous peoples. And a condition of the violent assimilation was that Indigenous peoples had to agree to live on individual plots of land that were carved from the US government's confiscation and partitioning of tribal lands. In Canada, for example, the Department of Immigration for a period of time during the settler colonial, or the real entrenchment of the settler colonial period, was called the Department of Immigration and Colonization, right? Making very clear those entanglements again. And around the same time in the United States, as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act was passed. This allowed slaveholders to kidnap and capture Black people they claimed had escaped. After the 1848 annexation, slave owners also formed militias to patrol the US-Mexico border to prevent Black people from escaping to Mexico. Some of the earliest bordering practices at the US-Mexico border were not only to keep migrants out, but were also to control enslaved Black people and keep them in. Contemporary immigration enforcement draws heavily from this practice. And again, I'm going to talk about that later on in thinking through racial capitalism, right? And how it's not only about keeping migrants out, but it's also this condition of deportability in order to control life and labor. A final point here in thinking through, again, the relationship between migrant justice struggles to Indigenous and Black peoples, and of course, Indigenous and Black is not mutually exclusive, is that even in thinking about who is a migrant and who is a refugee, it is so important in our contemporary era that we do not erase the experiences and often disproportionate violence against Indigenous and Black migrants and refugees. A large proportion of Central American and Mexican migrants and refugees to the US are Indigenous. A huge number of migrants and refugees trapped in Mexico as a result of the Remain in Mexico protocols are from Haiti and the African continent, and many of whom are currently organizing through the Assembly of African Migrants. And in the European context, for example, the formulation of the Black Mediterranean locates murderous European border policies in the material relations and roots of anti-Blackness. So here, returning full circle to the, one of my first points, so much of this migration is a result of ongoing colonialism and imperial displacement, underwritten by anti-Indigenous and anti-Black global violence, whether it's military occupations, land thefts, resource extraction, capitalist trade agreements, labor exploitation, or climate change. As Stuart Hall put it, quote, "Migration is increasingly the joker in the globalization pack," end quote. So as such, we can understand migration as both an act of individual self-determination and as an expression of decolonial reparations and redistribution long overdue. And in thinking about these global entanglements now, I want to talk about global imperialism, essential in thinking about the functioning of the border. So as I mentioned, of course, it's inseparable, right? The formation of the border is inseparable from the functioning of empire. One of the most poignant slogans, I think, in the migrant justice movement that's been echoed for decades is, we are here because you are there, right? We are here because you are there, which makes so plain that it is impossible to talk about, again, the so-called migration crisis without talking about the displacement crisis and without talking about how we are bound up structurally in these violences that we imagine as happening over there. And so, you know, in response to a lot of outright right-wing racism, you know, the kind of really exclusionary white supremacist rhetoric, oftentimes a liberal centrist response to that really right-wing white supremacy is often the kind of gestures to humanitarianism or benevolence, right? And those kinds of gestures to charity and benevolence and humanitarianism often sound like things like, oh, we need immigrants. Immigrants are good for the economy. Immigrants help with jobs. You know, we are all immigrants. We're all from somewhere. All of these kind of platitudes ignore the foundational violence of what creates migration, right? These migrations, for example, from Mexico and Central America, are often presented as from over there, not our problem, when in fact we know, right? We know that they are inextricable from displacements created by the US's dirty wars backing death squads, the counterinsurgency terror of the neoliberal war on drugs, or capitalist trade agreements like NAFTA. So when we're thinking again about the border crisis, it's much more accurately described as a crisis of displacement and immobility, as I said, but specifically generated by US policies, right? That again, we're bound up in these violences. But when thinking about imperialism, I actually want to talk about something else, because I think, you know, a lot of us would agree that imperialism and all of its kind of tentacles is a root cause of global migration, right? We know that the total number of migrants worldwide has reached 272 million people, 3.5% of the world's population. And that a lot of that, while, you know, it's hard to generalize in huge ways about why every single person is displaced and how that's related to someone else's narrative, we know that the global asymmetries of power when it comes to imperialism, when it comes to free trade agreements, when it comes to capitalism, when it comes to climate change, marks how certain people are more likely to be displaced. And especially as it relates to climate disasters, right? In 2016, new displacements caused by climate disasters outnumbered new displacements as a result of persecution by a ratio of 3 to 1. So we know this. We know the ways in which imperialism underwrites how migration in the contemporary era is playing out, or displacement in the contemporary era is playing out. But the actual point that I wanted to emphasize is not only that imperialism is a cause of displacement and migration, but that the management of global migration and that the outsourcing of border controls is increasingly becoming a method of preserving imperialism. So again, it's not just a cause and effect, but that the management of global migration in our contemporary era is a method of imperialism. So the US, Canada, Australia, and EU countries, their subordination of so-called third world countries in Central America, in Oceania, and Africa, and the Middle East is increasingly compelling countries in these regions to accept external border checkpoints, offshore detention, migration prevention campaigns, and expel deportees as conditions of trade and aid agreements. It is actually countries in the global south, countries like Libya, Mali, Mexico, Nauru, Niger, Papua New Guinea, Turkey, Sudan, that have become the new frontiers of border militarization. And this is really important, right? Because when, for example, President Biden says that he's no longer building Trump's border wall at the site of the border itself, it's so important to remember that that's because the Democrats, like Biden and you know, especially Obama before him, really perfected border outsourcing such that border militarization doesn't need to occur at the site of the border anymore. It can be outsourced, right? And so we've been seeing that in Mexico. It was under President Obama that the Merida Initiative was perfected, for example, and that predates Trump's Remain in Mexico protocols by at least 10 years. So in the United States, Customs and Border Protection has trained 15,000 border agents from 100 different countries. Todd Miller writes, quote, "Close your eyes and point to any landmass on a world map, and your finger will probably find a country that is building up its borders in some way with Washington's assistance," end quote. And it is this kind of externalizing of the border, right, that the US has been doing, that funds immigration enforcement in Mexico and El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras, that stops migrants and refugees well before they can even reach the US-Mexico border. And at one point, DHS actually declared that our southern border is no longer with Mexico. It's actually the Chiapas border with Guatemala, right? So this is the way in which imperialism is externalizing border enforcement. Europe has similarly constructed an entire fortress around itself that extends far beyond its borders. And this is, what makes the Mediterranean the most deadly border in the world. Countries across the Sahel region in Africa are especially pressured to accept the outsourcing of EU borders. And the EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa diverts billions of euros earmarked for aid to 26 African countries into surveillance and military equipment to prevent refugees from even leaving the continent. Most EU development agreements, trade agreements, and aid agreements with African countries now force these countries to implement border checkpoints and migration prevention campaigns as a condition of aid. So we can take two key things from this. First, that borders are not actually fixed lines simply demarcating territory. Borders are productive regimes that are firmly embedded in global imperialism, and border controls exist far beyond the territorial border itself. So I think we need to be paying far more attention to how the outsourcing of border controls is increasingly a method of maintaining imperial superpowers in the world, especially countries like US, Canada, Israel, India, Australia, New Zealand, UK, and Western and Central EU countries. Second is we have to understand how critical immigration-related diplomacy is to current global relations. Immigration diplomacy through the soft power of aid agreements, or in some cases, outright threats of trade war, is compelling countries across Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Oceania to accept outsourced migration controls, all of which cements imperial relations, maintains our global presence, and globalizes the violence of borders, right? So again, it's globalizing the violence of borders far beyond the site of the border itself, if you will. And that the idea of the border as porous, right, as not just about the fixed site on a map, but really as being externalized and internalized is so crucial. And the flip side of the externalizing of borders, right, the flip side of the outsourcing of borders is also the way in which the border is insourced. We know that the struggle for migrants and refugees and undocumented people doesn't exist at the border alone, right? If you're undocumented, the border is everywhere. The border is at a police checkpoint. It's at a school where you may not be able to enroll. It's at a hospital where you may be denied healthcare treatment. It's in public services where you may not be able to access public services if you're undocumented, depending on the country you're in. And this is crucial because the Nordic countries, for example, or countries like Canada, are often lauded in the left as kind of bastions of social democracy and public health, public services, right? Whether it's welfare, childcare, healthcare, et cetera. And not to throw the baby with the bathwater, like, of course, public services are important and they must be universal. But a lot of these social services are not universal and in fact act as border checkpoints against migrants and refugees. So Canada, where I live, for example, universal healthcare, Canadian universal healthcare is lauded and praised around the world. But very few people know about the reality of medical deportation in Canada, which is that if you are a migrant worker and you become seriously injured on the job, and you then try to access healthcare, you will actually be subject to most likely what's called a medical deportation, a medical repatriation, which is the Canadian healthcare system basically deeming you defective, no longer able to contribute to the economy. And you can no longer access healthcare, you can't access any social services, and you're then deported, right? So we start to see the everyday use of public services as a border checkpoint against migrants and refugees, right? So again, the border can exist anywhere. In that sense. The next thing that I wanted to talk about, and it's the main thing that I'll talk about, or the last main thing I'll talk about before closing here, is how crucial it is to be thinking about the relationship of racial capitalism to the border. So I've talked about the ways in which imperialism and empire are bound up in thinking about migration and displacement and immobility. And I want to talk next about how critical it is to be talking about racial capitalism in relationship to the border. And here I'm drawing on the works, of course, of the Black Marxist tradition and thinking through my framing of racial capitalism, the works of Cedric Robinson, Nabil Alexander, Robin D.G. Kelly, Angela Davis, and many others in the larger Black Marxist tradition. Cedric Robinson theorized the linkage between racial expropriation and capitalism as racial capitalism, right? So as to make clear that the social construction and the real differentiation of race is not a secondary outcome of capitalism, but rather that racism is constitutive of capitalism. So what is crucial here is that the racial expropriation of land, labor, and life itself is innate to capitalism. Capitalism relies on, requires, and reproduces racial hierarchies. In that sense, there can be no anti-capitalism that is not also anti-racist, and there cannot be an anti-racism that is not also anti-capitalist. Capitalism does not produce a universal relationship of waged labor. Racism is a material structure that is foundational to labor exploitation, to conquest, to territorial expansion, to dispossession, to enslavement, to corporate ownership, to surveillance, to bordering regimes, and really to the entire maintenance of the so-called global north vis-a-vis the global south. And here, the growing reliance on migrant workers demonstrates the centrality of bordering regimes to racial capitalism. So what are migrant worker programs? So just to be clear, when I'm talking about migrant worker programs, I'm not talking about all people who migrate for work, but rather those workers under state-sanctioned programs of temporary migrant work, right? So the H-2A, H-2B visas, for example, in the United States, particularly for farm workers. Low wage and temporary migrant workers are tied, I would say indentured, to one employer by contracts and visas. They're subjected to dangerous working conditions, forced labor, wage theft, and are denied access to labor protection, social services, and full immigration status. These migrant worker programs are really crucial to understand because on a global scale, migrant worker programs are now becoming the global template of what's called managed migration. So states around the world are dealing with what, from their liberal and neoliberal perspective is a conundrum, which is how do we ensure a constant supply of cheapened labor while ensuring that that labor does not have the full rights of citizenship, right? So cheapened labor. And to kind of resolve that conundrum, they've really moved towards temporary migrant worker programs. These programs are, of course, not new, right? The Bracero program really is one of the predecessors of it, and many other temporary migrant worker programs globally. But in today's era, it's Canada's temporary foreign worker program that has become what's called the Rolls-Royce template. And the United States has actually been looking to Canada to implement this. And of course, the United States has already implemented it, but and has for decades, but is looking to perfect it. And so it's so crucial to understand the state-sanctioned program when it comes to the border. So in the case of migrant workers, their distinct ordering as legal but deportable labor generates structural hierarchies between racialized migrant workers and citizen workers, and further affixes race to citizenship. This is not just a question of bad employers or a few bad sectors, though of course there are many bad employers, but of bordering regimes that facilitate the segmentation of certain workers as migrant workers. There is an entire class of workers who, even though they are our neighbors, they live alongside us, they work alongside us, they are in a completely different position in both the labor force and in the nation state, right? With completely different rights and entitlements. They are segmented as migrant workers. So how does this happen? Through the border. It wouldn't be possible without the border. Migration has been controlled by borders in order to both create an imperial racial regime of terror, which is, detention, deportation, the entire enforcement industrial complex, as well as to produce pliable labor, segmented by nationality and race and more, of course. The border acts as a spatial fix for capitalism and is a key pillar of both globalized racial capitalism and racist citizenship. Capitalism requires labor to be constantly segmented and differentiated, whether across race, gender, ability, caste, citizenship, ability, and more. These stratifications cheapen labor, right? There's no such thing as cheap labor. It is the conditions of capitalism that creates manufactured vulnerability. Lack of full and permanent immigration status is key to creating pools of hyper-exploitable cheapened labor. Migrant workers then really is a euphemism for third world workers. And jobs like farm work, domestic work, service work that cannot be outsourced are now being insourced. So in this way, insourcing and outsourcing represent two sides of the same capitalist and arguably imperialist coin, deliberately deflated labor and political power. So the state here, importantly, has not withered away under capitalism as a lot of left nationalists would argue, right? While austerity certainly has meant a weakened public sector, the financial and carceral systems of the state that guarantee capital flow and social control have actually expanded. We know this, the military, the police, the prisons, and border enforcement have all expanded. And borders are not intended to exclude all people or to deport all people. We know that the carceral arms of the state are so strong, the surveillance state is so immense that if it wanted to, every person could be deported. But that's not the aim. The aim is to create conditions of deportability, right? Not of deportation, but deportability, which in turn increases social and labor precarity. It is necessary to understand how important migrant workers are to racial capitalism, because it shows us that the border actually works in the interests of capital and not against it. And this is also why a lot of left nationalists are wrong, right? And this comes back to no border politics. Left nationalists often have a misdirected approach, which is also a racist approach, when they call for a shutdown of the border to migrant workers, or they say American jobs for American workers only, or that kind of rhetoric. In their formulation, migrant workers are essentially scab workers who are lowering the wage floor and stealing jobs from citizens, right? That's their formulation. But we have to remember that migrant workers don't suppress wages, bosses and borders do. Free capital requires immobilized labor that the border produces. And for migrants to be successfully pitted against workers, right? So this idea of migrants versus workers presupposes that migrants are not also workers participating and leading class struggles, right? We know racialized women, migrant workers in particular, are the spear of class struggle. So this kind of purportedly left nationalism actually dovetails perfectly with the right wing and bourgeois nationalism by increasing immigration enforcement, reproducing the logic of scarcity, and scapegoating that austerity depends on. It blunts class consciousness and maintains the international division of labor upon which capitalism relies. So that's why it is so important for left movements to take up the call, which is status for all workers, right? Which is put forward by migrant worker organizations. That means that all migrants should have full immigration status, the right to collectively organize and unionize, full rights to labor protections, and full health and safety protections. So the only way to fight back against the cheapening of labor is to engage in an internationalist fight against racist citizenship and racial capitalism, which is to say for immigration status and for labor protections. So in closing, I just want to talk about, what a no border politics is, right? And for me, a no border politics is so important. And also I want to say that it's different than an open border politics. So a lot of times people think a no border politics is, oh, you just open up the border and the world stays as is, right? Which kind of leads to these inevitable questions like, oh, if you get rid of the border, everyone will come here, or what about a brain drain in the global south, and all of this kinds of line of questioning. But I hope what I've illuminated in this conversation today is that a no border politics is not only about opening up the border. And here I'm thinking alongside organizations like Le Gilet Noir, Mi Gente, No One Is Legal, the Sans Papier movement, so many global movements who are articulating that we're not just talking about opening up the border and maintaining mass global inequality and social differentiation. A no border politics is necessarily more expansive than the site of the border itself. A no border politics is about dismantling all bordering, all ordering, and all exploitative regimes. We have to dismantle all the systems that uphold a system of apartheid that even allows the global north to exist in relationship to the global south, or of course, even conditions of the global south within the global north and conditions of the global north in the global south, right? And so we have to eradicate this asymmetrical reality of who is displaced, who is forced to move, and under what conditions. We need to fundamentally change this world. That means no more military occupations, no prisons, no police, no borders, no drone wars, no sweatshops, no corporations, no banks. That is all part of the revolutionary horizon. And so a no border politics is, again, it's expansive. It includes the freedom to stay and the freedom to move, meaning that no one should be forcibly displaced from their homes and lands, and that people should have the freedom to move with safety and dignity. Those may seem contradictory, but I would argue they're actually corollaries, right? Because the crux of a no border politics is nestled in the broader politics of home, coming back to Eduardo Galeano's invocation. How do we create a world where we all have a home, where we can all claim home, where we are all at home in our bodies, where the earth is cared for as a home, where non-human beings have a home? And this thinking of home is not a sentimental matter. At the edge of climate catastrophe, it's a pressing political issue, and homemaking and world making become synonymous. And I want to close with the prophetic words of Toni Morrison, who wrote, quote, "In this new space, one can imagine safety without walls, can iterate difference that is prized but unprivileged, and can conceive of a third, if you will pardon the expression, world, already made for me, most snug and wide open, with a doorway never needing to be closed. Home." Thank you.
Please join me in clapping quietly in our homes for what a really powerful talk. And I especially appreciate what you ended on there, Harsha. It was really opening my mind to think about, it's not just opening the border so that people can move, but about creating the conditions for people to live where they're rooted as well. And I think that's a really important intervention. We have some time now. I know some folks might have to go and rush to 2 o'clock class or meeting, but for those of us that can stay, we have time to ask Harsha questions. And there are a couple that were sent in the Q&A. If you have a question, please either post it in the chat or in the Q&A function, and we'll make sure those get asked. I think there's a really good question from Mackenzie. It says, can you talk a bit about how climate refugees / economic refugees are not recognized by many governments as refugees? And I know that that's something, that distinction between refugee and asylum seeker, you talk about a bit about in your book. So maybe you can speak a bit about that, but also I think this question about climate chaos and how that's exacerbating these processes of displacement. I wonder if you could talk about both of those things.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for that great question. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we have to recognize, sorry, that's my phone buzzing, is that one of the things that the state does, and also that the kind of global institutions like the International Organization for Migration have done, is to really create categories of migrants, right? And so, the UN Convention on Refugees, for example, defines who is considered a refugee or not. And it's important to remember that that really emerged and was solidified in the Cold War era, right? It didn't originate, but was really solidified in the Cold War era. And so the influences of anti-communism are very deeply entrenched in how political refugees are understood. And we certainly see this play out in practice. We know, for example, that, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, even up until the 90s, but really in those few decades, in the United States, for example, political refugees were people who were considered to be fleeing communist regimes and were granted refugee status and, welcomed with open arms if we think about refugees fleeing Vietnam and Cambodia, for example, right? Because those regimes were demonized. Or white Cubans fleeing Castro's regime, right? So that kind of persecution fits within the imperial regime, and particularly the Cold War era narrative of communism being oppressive, right? And people fleeing communist regimes. And at the same time, when we look at what was happening with Haitians, it was, and Alison Mounts and Jenna Lloyd write about this, the ways in which the Cold War era emerged with anti-Blackness to really inform the mass detention of Haitians who were vilified as bogus refugees, as migrants, who were not refugees because they were fleeing US prop dictatorships, right? Papa Doc and Baby Doc, the Duvalier families and their generations, right? So US puppet regimes. And so Haitians who were fleeing US prop dictatorships, US backed dictatorships, were not considered to be refugees because of course that would implicate the United States government in massive human rights atrocities, right? And so we see this kind of narrative play out in many different ways. And that really informs the distinction between political refugees and so-called bogus economic migrants, and the distinctions that continues to inform like why those are considered two different categories, right? And of course, if we think about it, we know we live in a world where political persecution and economic terror cannot easily be parsed apart, right? Like there's very few elements of political persecution that aren't informed by material structures of the economy, and vice versa. Economic terror is a mass political system. And so we have to see that that distinction really serves a particular political purpose to increasingly limit, right? To limit and govern who can move. And that's really also, it goes back to, the massive structures of the UN, right? The massive ways in which refugees are contained in refugee camps and are, given numbers and sorted. And now increasingly under some of the most dangerous kinds of algorithmic and facial recognition surveillance, right, is being literally pioneered in refugee camps around the world. So we have to be really thoughtful about how that system is really a system of control and containment and division. And when it comes to climate refugees, the world has refused to recognize climate refugees, which is not dissimilar to the fact that the world has refused to largely ignore that climate change is a pressing reality. And an apocalyptic present for so many coastal communities, island communities, farming communities, indigenous communities. And so it's part of the course when it comes to climate change denial. But at the same time, we see that climate change and climate refugees have actually now become one of the main reasons for the fortification of borders, right? So the new kind of national security discourse in the United States, in Australia, in Europe, is the so-called threat of climate displacement. So not actually recognizing the rights of climate refugees, not doing anything to tackle climate change, but using the threat of, again, mass ungovernable movement of climate displaced peoples to further securitize the border, right? Like that's what's happening, I think.
Yeah. Anyway, well said. Could you say the name of the people who had written about or maybe put it in the chat?
Sure, Alison Mounts and Jenna Lloyd.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah.
There's another great question here from Adriana, who works locally with the American Friends Service Committee. It says, Harsha, so great to hear clarity amidst a fabricated crisis at the border. This fiscal year was declared as the deadliest with more migrant deaths. Let's keep in mind this number is a documented number by the agency. Hundreds, if not thousands, will never be counted. What is interesting, and I wonder if you can speak on the dynamic that places Border Patrol as the saviors of migrants and claim themselves as the agency that will, quote, punish those responsible for the deaths I'll just add, by going after, quote unquote, smugglers, I think is what Adriana was talking about.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think here, what's instructive is actually the European example, because the EU really laid the groundwork for laundering border missions as rescue for the rest of the world. And, this has been taking place in the EU since the 90s. And what it really is, and same as the United States and same as elsewhere, but again, I'm going to use the EU as the example because it's historically one of the most robust examples and clear examples. And so what the EU has done, and now it's Frontex, Frontex being the EU's border patrol, basically, they have presented themselves as the saviors of migrants in the Mediterranean, right? And so so we have two things happening, or well, let's say three things happening in the Mediterranean. One is you have EU border policies that make it impossible for people to cross safely, right? Which is the same as in the United States, same as elsewhere, where borders are becoming increasingly militarized. You have smart borders, and you have the terrain that is physically made more dangerous, or people are forced to move through more physically dangerous terrain because of the fortification of borders at safer routes. So, right, people can't use the land route anymore, for example. They're forced to use more militarized routes in the EU. So that's the first thing, is border policies make it harder for people to move safely. The second thing that starts to happen is that there's a two-pronged approach to how the EU deals with the border. So the vast majority of its resources goes to border militarization, right? So drone missions, surveillance programs, actual deterrence, boots on the ground. That's the majority of it. The EU at one point even dispatched NATO ships into the Mediterranean to ensure that migrants were not crossing. But then a small amount of their budget, but like the vast amount of their PR goes into rescue missions, right? So they launder the work of Frontex by saying that Frontex is saving migrants who have again been placed in harm's way, who are in boats that are sinking as a result of border policies. And also we now have EU policies not dissimilar to the United States, where solidarity is criminalized, right? Where captains of boats are facing years and years in prison, same as the US-Mexico border, where people engaged in solidarity or even humanitarian work are criminalized for acts of solidarity, right? So as solidarity gets criminalized, and as migrants are facing more and more dangerous terrain, the Frontex emerges as the rescuer and the savior, right? So border militarization gets laundered as rescue. And again, that does a number of things, right? It turns the gaze away from the state as being the primary culprit for why people are increasingly taking dangerous journeys, right? So again, that passivity of border deaths as if though it's not border killings. But also it facilitates the narrative of individual bad actors, right? So the idea of smugglers and traffickers, or, at the US-Mexico border of coyotes, et cetera. And again, what that does is move the gaze away from the state, because we know that the primary reason that people are relying on other individuals, some of whom are, there's a huge difference between smuggling and trafficking, first of all, right? Like sometimes you're relying on the assistance of someone for money and there's no extortion other than a financial exchange. Other times there is extortion and violence. But even across that spectrum, the primary reason that people are forced to rely on a third person or another actor to facilitate their movement is because the border is militarized, right? Like when, those of us who have access to a passport can hop on a plane, we don't need somebody else. We book our ticket, we get on a plane, we fly, right? Like again, not all movement is criminalized, not all movement is scrutinized. So, the criminalization of migration is what facilitates smuggling and trafficking, right? In the EU, there was a study done last year, and they found that over 90% of anti-smuggling charges were actually laid against people who were assisting people in movement, including NGOs. So either family members who were assisting their family members to move, or actual NGOs. So across the EU, over 90% of charges for smuggling and trafficking were actually laid in order to again, criminalize solidarity, right? So we have to be very cautious of the state's smuggling and trafficking narratives. We have to understand the work that it's intended to do. And really the ways in which it's just another carceral response, right? By trying to point out this kind of, these individual bad actors, by shifting the gaze away from both the state creating the conditions for smuggling and extortion and trafficking to exist, and for the state actually creating the conditions of death at the border and killing at the border.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's reminding me of pinkwashing and greenwashing and all of these other strategies that the state uses to deflect from its own violence. And I'm wondering if we can come up with a catchy washing title, border washing, I don't know what to call it. Yeah, but thanks for naming that. There are a couple of questions about organizing that I wonder if we can turn to for the last 15 minutes, and actually one of them is my own. I'm wondering if you have any examples of folks who are building the kinds of transnational solidarity that we need to challenge the externalization of the border that you talked about. So I'm thinking in the book, you talk about detention centers being built in the southern part of Mexico. And, I've been grappling a lot with what does that mean for those of us who are trying to close detention centers in the US, and what kinds of new forms of solidarity do we need to actually effectively dismantle detention and not just outsource it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And for me, it's pressing as well, right? Because when we domesticate our struggle, we don't just lose the internationalist struggle as a necessarily kind of ethical orientation, but it also means we're missing how violence is outsourced and how the state reconfigures itself, and of course its relationship to imperialism, as you point out, the kind of outsourcing that's happening of violence. The example, I'll turn again to the EU, because I don't think it's a coincidence, right? Again, the EU being the world's deadliest border, being one of the sites of major migration, being so close in proximity to North and Western Africa, to the Middle East, to South and Western Asia, et cetera, means that struggles in the EU for migrant justice, I think, can offer us a lot. That's one of the reasons I wrote Border and Rule, because I think even in our struggles for migrant justice, we can become weirdly nationalist, right? And one of the organizations that comes to mind is the Pan-African Network of Migrants and Refugees, who are doing a lot of work, not only to organize against the murderous policies of the EU, but also to fight against the outsourcing of the EU that's happening with over 24 African countries, right? And to look at the ways in which, again, that's connected to imperialism, how that's often connected to puppet dictatorships in people's respective countries. So I think that is important. That's one of the examples I would point to. Also organizing in Australia, where there's cross-organizing in Australia, because so much of Australian detention is been offshored for decades, right? A lot of Australian detention centers have been offshored way before North America started to offshore detention centers, not as an exception, but as a rule, right? And so here, the kind of organizing, I'd say less prevalent, but still nonetheless, and thinking about the entanglements, again, of imperialism, when Australia offshores its detention to Papua New Guinea or Nauru, sorry. And how is that so clearly bound up in Australian imperialism, where until very recently, both Papua New Guinea and Nauru were formally, let alone post-colonial, put in quotes, but formally colonies of Australia, right? And the ways in which trade and aid is used to force those countries to accept Australia's offshore detention centers. So the kind of organizing that's been happening between organizers in Australia with people in Papua New Guinea and Nauru, with people in Indonesia, where the next kind of round of Australian offshore detention is happening. with people from countries that are coming, for detainees from Iran, from Pakistan, from Syria. All of those kind of transnational solidarities, I think, are some examples, but we certainly need more. And I know it's no easy task. There's a lot of material barriers to it, but increasingly, I think it's what needs to be more central to our work, because the outsourcing of violence really means that we're going to be playing whack-a-mole.
Definitely. I was joking the other day that we needed to come up with a version of the North American Free Trade Agreement that is all of us on Turtle Island who are fighting border imperialism. Thanks for those examples. Another organizing question is from Anne-Marie, who asks, in your organizing, how do you navigate tensions between calling for demands that meet practical urgent needs for some, and yet inherently reinforce racial borders and citizenship regimes? For example, TPS, which stands for Temporary Protective Status in the US.
Yeah, that's a hard one. It's always it's like the organizer's dilemma forever. What I will say is, one of the movements that I was part of for decades was No One Is Illegal, and our demands were always status for all people. And really, in the name No One Is Legal, it articulates that you believe that no human being is illegal. There should be no deportations, no detentions. And I'd say in our organizing, we rarely supported particular visa regimes. So we really did stay away from arguing, what would be the equivalent of TPS here, but certainly face that conundrum when you're individually fighting deportations and detentions, right? You're like supporting so many individuals constantly, and how to do that without reinforcing borders or reinforcing the idea of like the good immigrant, if you will, because so much of fighting deportations is telling, is humanizing people, is telling their story. And often that means presenting a certain kind of narrative in your organizing that reinforces a certain idea of citizenship and a certain idea of who belongs, right? And I think what always kind of offset that, if you will, or not offset it, but placed it within the broader context. One thing was unavoidable when you're organizing through No One Is Legal. It's clear that when you're supporting one person or working on one campaign, you still have a broader vision. And the second was always articulating that even when you're articulating narrow demands, you always articulate your broader demand with that, right? So status for all people, no deportations, no detentions. So if we're fighting the deportation of one person, stop the deportation of X person and stop all deportations, or, free X person, free them all. And so a lot of it was in that narrative-based articulation of organizing and visions. And a lot of it was also doing a lot of, as organizing is, you do a lot of work at the same time that makes those contradictions less alive, if you will, because you're doing multiple campaigns at one time, you're doing so much organizing at one time. And one of the things that we always did, for example, in No One Is Legal, and that so many social movements are increasingly doing, is always centering, for example, Indigenous sovereignty. So when we say no one is legal, we'd often, again, have a corollary, no one is legal, Canada is illegal. That would center Indigenous liberation and sovereignty while, recognizing that we're fighting this, this inherently, this tense idea of citizenship, right? And what is citizenship on stolen land even mean? So holding those contradictions is the reality of organizing, but I think doing it in ways that makes visible those contradictions is actually a good thing, right? Because it means we're wrestling with the future as we're building the present. Or wrestling with the present as we're building the future, I should say. Maybe both.
Yeah, I know Anne-Marie works with the Free Them All Coalition and does a lot of organizing around like the mass deportations of Haitians and Cameroonians at the border. And so I know that is something that has come up around, if we can secure TPS, it's actually not just an individual that we're supporting, but a large group of people. And so I think that sort of wrestling with like messaging around that in a way that doesn't reinforce some of these binaries that you're talking about is an ongoing practice.
Yeah, and if I may add one thing, like again, it'll so depend on people's context and their strategy. I can't prescribe that in any way because people know their struggle the best and know their terrain of struggle the best. One guiding principle that I've used, and is of course an abolitionist practice that's come, that people are increasingly being popularized to, is the idea of reformist and non-reformist reforms, right? So reformist reforms are those that will reinscribe the power of the state. And one could argue all reforms do that, but you kind of have to parse through it. You have to parse through it. And non-reformist ones are ones that increase the possibility of freedom, right? They increase the possibility of freedom. So when we're organizing in detention centers, I remember this so clearly. There was going to be, I won't give the whole story, but there was a whole thing that was going on in Canada about reviewing detention centers as a result of organizing. And so then, when you win, you're like, it's kind of a victory, but now we're stuck in this framework. And a number of the reforms were ones that did increase the possibility of freedom, like more access on phones for people, more access to the library, more visitation. Like those are concrete material things in the struggle to dismantle all cages that materially means something positive in people's lives, right? You're increasing the possibility of being on the outside. And then there were others that are reformist reforms, like the possibility of being released from detention only to have to wear an electronic bracelet, right? Which is just caging yourself. And so I think doing the work of assessing non-reformist and reformist reforms and how they measure up to the possibility of freedom, whether they make it harder for us to fight or make it easier for us to fight, those are all questions, only each organizer on the ground will be able to discern that because it's so context specific.
Yeah, thank you. There are a couple of questions. I'm wondering if I can kind of roll them into one for our last few minutes. One question is about insourcing. Maybe you mentioned that earlier in the talk. And another one is about other state social institutions that might be participating in border imperialism. I think you had mentioned medicine earlier, and the person's also talking about schools or religious groups. So I don't know if you want to touch on either of, there's some message you can leave us with that touches on either of those or anything else you want to raise.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that quickly. Elaborate on what insourcing of labor looks like. Again, I think one of the ways we can think about insourced labor is the migrant worker program, right? So again, labor that can't be outsourced. So when we think about labor being outsourced, we think about manufacturing, garment industries, et cetera, mass manufacturing in particular. So the work that can't be insourced, domestic work, retail work, construction work, farm work, that is work that is being insourced by bringing in migrant workers, which again, I would argue is a euphemism for third world workers because it's racialized workers who are working in the global north in conditions of the global south, right? The reason that labor is outsourced is to provide quote unquote cheapened labor, right? Companies get to pay sweatshop labor wages to build, to make our clothes, to manufacture our cell phones, to make our technology. And that's that labor that can't be outsourced is insourced under the same conditions. And again, the border is the spatial fix for that, right? Like what allows the segmentation of wages is the border, right? Like what makes it possible for workers around the world to be paid differential wages is a pillar of that is the border. And in terms of other institutions that participate in deportation practices, I think that there's really so many social service kind of organizations. And again, it looks different in different places. But for example, where I live, schools are often a place of, again, the pipeline to deportation. And in fact, there was a huge campaign, which is, ongoing in various ways, but in Toronto, the capital of Canada, Oh gosh, did I say Toronto is the capital of Canada? Sorry, Toronto is not the capital of Canada. One of the main cities of Canada. Oh my God. One of the biggest cities in Canada. There was, and this ties actually to the church, because it was a Catholic school that turned over 2 children who were Canadian born, but whose parents were undocumented, or sorry, one of the children was Canadian born. But the parents were undocumented, and they basically detained the CBSA, Canada Border Services agencies, came into the school. The school collaborated and consented, turned these kids over, and the kids were used as bait for their parents and their dad in particular, who had gone into hiding, to force him out of hiding. This family was eventually deported on Canada Day in 2000, and I want to say 5 or 6, several years, I mean, almost a decade ago. But it sparked a huge campaign called Education Not Deportation and Access Without Fear, right? Which is the idea that social services agencies and really social institutions, whether it's schools, whether it's childcare, whether it's gender-based violence services, whether it's shelters, whether it's childcare spaces, schools, healthcare, all of it, that all of these services should be accessible to people irrespective of their immigration status. And more importantly, that these agencies and their workers should not collaborate, should never be collaborating with immigration enforcement, right? And so, again, that's the ways in which the border is internalized, right? The border is not just at the border. You fear detention and deportation through all of these state structures that can become complicit. Child welfare services is another one, of course, and social workers. How these agencies and workers, workers who are, supposedly in the care sectors, become complicit in bordering practices.
So to try to turn that on a good ending note, yes. I think that creates more opportunities for us to resist border imperialism wherever we are located in, within empire, in the university, in social services, in the nonprofit industrial complex. There's all these ways we can counter the language and practices of bordering. I want to thank you so much for your talk today. And for everyone who made it through to the end. The event was recorded, and I'll be sending out a link to everyone who registered after the recording's complete. Also be posted to the Women's Studies YouTube channel, and I'll send a link to that as well if you'd like to send it to your friends and neighbors who weren't able to make it today. Thank you for your amazing questions. If there is anyone here from Free Them All, and I see several people, if you want to hang tight for a couple of minutes, I can bring you on as a panelist if you want to introduce yourself to Harsha. But if you have to run, I understand, and I'll see you all later.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm going to bring a couple of folks in really quick. If they... Hi, Adriana and Anne-Marie. I was going to try to introduce you to Harsha, but it seems like she left. So never mind. I'll talk to you all soon.
I got super excited because it said something that I was going to be promoted into something. I was like, finally, after so many years.